Hello, good to see you again. Welcome to Enigmatic. Apologies if my voice breaks up every now and then. I am getting over the flu, where I also had tonsillitis, so I've been laid up the whole week. Feeling a little bit better today, but still a little bit drained. All the same, did want to make another video and explore another idea. Today I'd like to talk about vulnerability, something I think that most people have a pretty hard time with, and understandably so, especially if we consider social conditioning and what seems to be expected of us. If we look at a definition of vulnerability, it's a state or quality of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. And what I would like to say about it is that it's the way of being honest about how you feel or how something makes you feel. And to put a caveat, excuse me, on what I added to that, that's not to say that being vulnerable is thoughtless. I actually think that being vulnerable is very thoughtful. And I say that because there's times where we become offended by something or something hurts us, and it's our misperception of that thing, or it's our own self-esteem that is really being hurt, and that thing isn't actually that hurtful. It's a very particular line that I like to draw, especially this day and age where it seems like everybody's offended by everything. But vulnerability is something that I find to be a strength overall, and something that I find to be authentic when I come across it with others. And to be honest, I find not being vulnerable at all, or trying to avoid vulnerability, is really just a deception of self, because you can't even be vulnerable with yourself. I like to think about, tough guys. Men don't cry. Really? I'm pretty sure we're all equipped with the same capacity for emotion, so are we just lying to ourselves when we say something like that? And I think it's probably easy for me because I've been pretty open about crying since I was a kid. I'm a crier, like, it's what it is. There have been periods of time where, especially in the spring and the summer, because I have reverse seasonal affective disorder, where I cry profusely all day for no reason. It's happened at the gym. It's happened at work. So, I mean, for me, it's somewhat easier because in some ways I didn't have a choice. But also I got to see how people treated me based on who I am as a person and the mind that I have in conjunction with that vulnerability. And so that being said, even in times when I'm vulnerable, I don't really feel or worry too much about being taken advantage of or slighted in any way. And if somebody does want to try to make that attempt, that says something more about them than it does about me, in my opinion. It tells me that they are not in touch with their own vulnerability, their own deeper emotions, the emotions that are tough to deal with, that are tough to handle, or at least the ones that we're told are tough to deal with and tough to handle. We're told that fear is a bad thing. You shouldn't be afraid. You have people out there that try to actually claim they don't fear anything, which I think it was Worf in Star Trek, The Next Generation. So yeah, I'm going back to the early 90s with this one. But talking to Wesley, when Wesley is getting ready for an exam, and the test in the exam is specifically around his greatest fear. And he's surprised to hear that Worf was afraid during his exam. And Worf lets Wesley know, like, straight up, he's like, only a fool feels no fear. It's about what you do in the face of that fear. And so me personally, with fear especially, and I deal with it, on a regular basis, but I try to step into it. I try to be intimate with my fear. Because when I'm intimate with my fear, with what scares me, or not even what scares me, just the feeling of the fear, like that fear being, almost that essence, that reaction that I have to something that is external to me, and sometimes even afraid or feeling fear of something that is internal to me. When I can kind of, in a sense, be one with it, it doesn't control me. It's just another feeling that I feel, and I retain my autonomy in my deeper self. And I think that's important. It's something that we can take through the world to have better action. Because when we're in denial, then we lash out at people, Not being vulnerable, for example, can lead to emotional constipation. If you have a fear of letting your spouse know how they made you feel in a certain instance, or even a friend, anybody, a coworker, your boss, whatever, that not acknowledging what happened and what it made you feel can be damaging, and it can get stopped up inside of you, and then you suddenly are not managing any of your emotions very, very well, and not feeling some of the emotions that you would rather feel. And so I think that we are deterring connections with others when we choose to not be vulnerable. um, and sometimes we're doing people a disservice as well. I'll give an example, without being specific about the people involved, but there was a point where an individual I knew that I worked with made a comment about how he went to a UFC fight with his girlfriend, and it was cool until he had to watch the women fight. He's like, that was really hard for me to watch. And I appreciated him saying that, because he was kind of he was showing the conditioning and indoctrination through culture that he has, because he thinks that women should always look pretty and they shouldn't be fighting and things like that, even though they have the capacity to fight each other just as well as a man fights another man. But where he slipped up was when he said, but I can watch hood rats fight all day, that shit's funny. And so naturally, I haven't divulged this yet, but I am an African American male. And so I wasn't really offended, because I understood that it was his ignorance that made him say that and to have that kind of perspective. But at the same time, there was a little bit of trepidation in acknowledging to him and for him why that is a slippery slope, especially considering the demographic of the people that work next door. And so I let him know that, that's sideways racist. And he's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. And in order to just kind of hammer the point forward for him, and keep in mind, I didn't mention this before, but he was my boss at the time. But I went ahead and I searched on YouTube hood rat fights, and I said, what do you see? And naturally he said, okay, black women. And I was like, yes, exactly. Like, that's what that term really pertains to, is black women. And he got really upset. He got really upset with me. He ended up storming off. And I had to be vulnerable in my heritage to be able to elucidate that to him, so that he wouldn't make that slip up again in the future. Because I don't think that at his heart he is actually, meaning to be a bigoted person. I think a lot of bigotry, especially nowadays, not to say that there isn't any explicit bigotry, but I think a lot of it is implicit. It's subconscious and it's indoctrination. It's kind of like the saying that people used to have, the sideways compliment of, she's pretty for a black girl, which alludes to the idea that black women aren't usually pretty, which beauty is beauty. The standard of beauty is something that is also indoctrinated into us. But the point being is that I had to be vulnerable to him at that point. And the vulnerability that I've shared with him over time, I know that I was able to get some amalgam of respect because of it. And it wasn't because I just, lashed out with what my feelings were, but that I thoughtfully, divulged what I was thinking and feeling based on some external input. And so again, that comes back to how I think that this is a mindful type of process that we need to take when we want to be vulnerable, but it is important to be vulnerable. And first and foremost, that means that we have to be willing to be vulnerable with ourselves. And one thing that you can do that can help that is just sit in silence. Put your phone away. Don't turn on the TV. Don't have on any music. If you can, sit in front of a white wall and just stare at the white wall and see what comes up, and be willing to be with what comes up. Because I guarantee that aside from potential boredom, almost guaranteed boredom for most people, but aside from boredom, some tough emotions and some things that you're likely avoiding will come up. And if you're willing to be with them, then you're doing yourself a huge service. And not only that, you're getting to know yourself a lot more. And as much as we'd like to think that we do know ourselves, there's always more to learn about ourselves, especially considering that you're not the same person all the time. You're always a new person. The past yous only have continuity and certain experiences that are the same That's what makes you have a connection. So I hope I'm making some sense here. I feel like I'm bouncing around a little bit, which is really funny because I actually took notes and I'm looking at these notes and I still feel like I'm bouncing around a little bit. But some of that is just how my mind works. So, um, but vulnerability, while it's something viewed as weakness, you're opening yourself up in a raw way. It's actually a strength. It's not easy to do. And so when you're willing to do it, that shows a degree of strength and a degree of fortitude. And in doing so, you also increase your resilience. And that resilience is resilience for life. The other thing that I feel that it really does is it increases our emotional awareness. There's times where we might be feeling something and we don't know that we're feeling it because we're trying to stifle it subconsciously so much. And that also leads to what I was saying before, emotional constipation, and that is an actual term. You can look that up, but it's really just the suppression of emotions and the damage that can cause. Emotions, like almost anything else, like the food that you eat and things like that, it has to go through a process before it moves on, before it does something else, before it transmutes into something else. Um, And the other thing that I really appreciate about it, especially being a psychedelic guide, is that I can access another person's reality through their vulnerability. And that is like so authentic to me. And that is so honest. And it's beautiful to watch somebody being honest with themselves through being honest with me when they're in a journey. And I think that's something of value, because in the social media age that we live in, everything seems like a facade. I can't get past it. You look on Instagram, for example, and a lot of people seem like they're living some of the most perfect lives ever, and it's like it's not like that. It is not like that. Um, Self-awareness, in my opinion, is what brings not necessarily happiness, but wholeness, and wholeness can bring equanimity. And I mean, I don't, like I said earlier too, I don't blame anybody for avoiding emotions or avoiding vulnerability because it's hard and it's scary and it's contrary to what we've been taught. So, for example, how many of us, whether male or female, growing up, were told to stop crying, before the age of 10? Times where we, kind of just cry a little bit more freely because something upsets us or hurts us or disappoints us. Stop crying, stop crying. Instead of helping us understand the emotional impact that we're feeling at the time and the intensity that comes with it, and that is what is leading to the tears that we are shedding, we're just told to like stifle that emotion. And we learn that that emotion is a bad thing and that we shouldn't be, using it, and we shouldn't be feeling it. Which that doesn't do us any good. That doesn't help us to be whole. That doesn't help us to be truly with ourselves. That only helps us to deny ourselves in a certain way. And the other thing about it too is that you can't necessarily be vulnerable all the time with everyone. You do have to look out for yourself in being vulnerable. So I got bullied a lot growing up, and some of the reasons that I got bullied was because I was vulnerable and I was willing to be vulnerable, and I wouldn't let that go. And it's kind of funny because in order for me to get bullied less, I had to be even more vulnerable. So in 8th grade, I had just gotten a fresh haircut, and this kid who I thought was my friend came up and he just popped me upside the back of the head so hard, and I just lost my shit on him, and I started crying and I started yelling at him, and I was like, "Why'd you hit me?" Like I was like, "I thought we were fucking cool." And he looks at me dead in the eye and he's just like, "You just need to hit somebody." And I really hated that because I've always been not really a violent person. Don't get me wrong, I love action movies. I used to Thai box. I wrestled in high school. I used to box. Um, I like, violence in sport, and I like it in entertainment, I suppose. But when it's outside of those contexts, I don't like it. It's scary. And so I had to be vulnerable in accessing, a rage part of me, which growing up, I also wasn't able to express my anger very much. I had to stifle a whole lot of anger. And I do know that's why I deal with a lot of anger nowadays. I have a lot of resting anger inside of me. And I also hope that right now you guys can hear some of the vulnerability that I'm sharing that I have with all of this. Because I'd like to use myself as an example of why it's great to be vulnerable. But anyway, so I remember that I walked up to this kid after my friend told me, you had to hit somebody. I walked up to this kid, and he was with all of his boys. And I remember that there was a time where I broke down in front of him, in front of all of his boys, and it made them, punk me that much more. I was vulnerable, and it made them punk me that much more. And I could have gotten my butt whooped in this context, but I went up to him and I tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around, acted like I was going to hit him. He flinched. And for a lot of kids, I don't know if this happens like in the UK or in other parts of the world, but there's a game in the US called Two for Flinching. And if somebody makes you flinch, they get to hit you 2 times. So I made him flinch. They weren't expecting my little butt to come up and make anybody flinch. And he flinched. And all of his boys, like, I thought they were going to, swarm on me, but instead they were just like, oh. And he turned his shoulder to the side. I hit him twice, and I walked off. And when I walked off, I was just so angry because I was mad that I had to do that. But it was something that was necessary in order for me to get bullied a little bit less. You kind of had to play the game a little bit. But at the same time, that didn't make me any less emotive. I've always been an emotional person. It's part of my intensity. It's just about how you manage that kind of thing. So the funny thing about it was that I ended up connecting with a lot more of those guys later on, because when I was able to get them isolated and we were able to just like talk and be real about things, I could let them know how I felt and like why I was the way I was and why I didn't fit in with them. And not all of them, but some of them were a lot more understanding, and they punked me and bullied me a whole lot less. And so in a certain way, I'm glad my friend popped me upside the back of the head so hard that made me break down to him telling me, you got to go hit somebody. Keep in mind, I don't condone violence, but so you do need to find like the right people to be raw around. The people that I consider the closest to me and that are my best friends are the ones that I can be the most raw and honest with about how I'm feeling. Not about like what's going on with other people or things like that, but about how I'm feeling, what my emotions are, what my feelings are, and why they are that way. And it's because they never look down on me for it. They also acknowledge and have the emotional awareness, or the EQ, emotional quotient, to be able to conceptualize and provide empathy to me for what I happen to be experiencing, which that kind of thing helps us to process emotions that much more. And it's funny because I look at the world and how this is something that is hard for a lot of people, and I can't blame anybody, because where is somebody supposed to learn these skills from? Most things that we learn we're taught. We're taught to look a certain way and to behave a certain way and to act a certain way so that we get certain types of respect. But what's funny is sometimes going against the grain and doing what's contrary is what gets you even more respect and connects you more with people. And I think about it, the other thing I wanted to say in regards to finding the right people is, I put out little testers with individuals to see how they'll handle me being vulnerable. And if somebody, is dismissive, or they want to like try to poke fun, or they immediately turn it into humor, that lets me know that that's probably not somebody that's best to be vulnerable with unless it's absolutely necessary. I can't be vulnerable with them in a manner that is going to connect us, because they're too busy trying to avoid tough emotions. They're avoiding my tough emotions, and when they avoid my tough emotions, that means they're probably avoiding their own tough emotions. And so just acknowledge people's responses to when you are showing how you really feel and divulging the particulars around that. And then at the end of the day, don't fault them for it, because they just haven't learned. And I don't think there should be an expectation that they should know already. We all learn different things at different times in our lives, and that's why for me personally, I will always be a student of some sort. I'm always learning from the gestalt of life. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Because if we're not learning new stuff and whatnot, like, I'm sorry, like, life's gonna get real boring. And yeah, so I think that's really what I wanted to cover and the gist that I wanted to get to on it. And the other thing too is that I'll share a little bit more about myself that I haven't said, just to kind of give you all more of my vulnerability. But I do deal with what in the UK is known as complex PTSD. If I'm not mistaken, in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for mental health in the US, it's dissociative PTSD, which is just a long-term form of PTSD. It's just like ongoing trauma. And then as a result of that, I do deal with major depression and persistent depressive disorder. So like I said earlier, deep down inside me, I am pretty angry very often and pretty sad very often. But I don't let that, stop me from trying to, one, be more whole and be better, be, more joyful. And two, I don't allow it to taint my view of the life that I've lived. Because I'm in the U.S. I've had a lot of privilege by being in the U.S., even if I am black. If we look at the way the world operates, everywhere else, it's pretty rough. There's 8 billion people on this planet, and 80% of which live on less than $10 a day. So I've lived a good life, despite how I feel inside. But I do have my trials and my tribulations, and I do find them extremely difficult and hard, and they're painful. But here I am. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't triggering at all. I hope that you found some value in it. I hope you found some humor in it. And be good to you, be good to others, and take care. Be well. Much love.